Hello once again, and welcome to another wonderful study in the book of Genesis. Today we'll be in the chapter 39 of the book of Genesis. It's lesson number 10 on your quarterly. It's page number 68 if you have a quarterly. Once again, if you do not, that's fine. I'll lead you right through this, but this lesson is dated February 7th of 2021. Lesson 10, Joseph is protected in Egypt, and we're looking at Genesis chapter 39, focusing on 39. Our lesson text also is chapter 40, but we'll just be focusing on 39 today in our lesson. And I like to read this application there of what the writers have here for our lesson today. The aim or what we can apply to our lives, hopefully, amongst other things, that the student will conclude that he should be faithful to the truth even while he is being mistreated. So we as children of God should know that as children of God, you're going to be mistreated. But we need to have an understanding that through all of this mistreatment, through all of our trials and tribulations, we are to remain faithful to Jesus Christ and to the cause of Christ and to his kingdom work here on this earth. Now, we look at Joseph here in the life of Joseph and what's going on in his life. We know that he has been sold into slavery. He was thrown in the pit by his brothers and sold into slavery. That Ishmaelite band was heading down to Egypt. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver, and then they took him on down into Egypt. And that's where we are today. But we need to have an understanding that the protective hand of God was on Jesus even when he was in the pit, and it was still upon him as he entered Egypt as a slave. So the hand of God is upon Joseph in every aspect of his life, in the pit and even entering Egypt as a slave. Now, even though Joseph did not know it, he didn't know everything, and even though Joseph did not know it, God was protecting him, and he was preparing him for the future, which was going to be to deliver his family. We're going to study in the next few chapters where famine is going to enter the land, and Joseph is going to be head of many things there in Egypt, and his family is going to come down, and his family's going to come down during the famine, and Joseph is going to provide for him. So the Lord here in the life of Joseph is protecting him and preparing him for the future, that he's going to be deliverer of his family. Now, in the final chapters of Genesis, in the book of Genesis, we find that Joseph will go through many trials and tribulations. And if you're living in this world today and you are a child of God, you are going through trials and tribulations. And so just like Joseph, he went through many trials and tribulations, but there's something about Joseph here. Joseph did not forget who he is. He didn't forget who he is. He's a Hebrew. He didn't never forget that. He never claimed to be an Egyptian. He was down there and he was part of the Egyptian culture, but he never claimed to be an Egyptian. He knew who he was, and that was a Hebrew. He remembered where he came from. He came from the promised land. He didn't come from Egypt. He came from the promised land, and he was fully aware of that, and he never forgot that. But more importantly than both of these things, the fact that he knew who he was and knew where he came from, more important than that, he knew and never forgot who his God was and who his God is, and that is Jehovah. There was many gods in the land of Egypt. There were many pagan worshipers. They had a God for everything. Joseph here never forgot who he was, where he came from, or who his God is, which was Jehovah. Now, Joseph did not allow his circumstances to change him. And we have things going on in our life today that circumstances that gets us out of our normal routine, if you will. And so our circumstances are ever changing. And Joseph's circumstances were ever changing. However, we are to make sure that circumstances may change our surroundings, but these circumstances should never change our heart. Joseph is an example of that. His surroundings changed, his circumstances changed, but he never forgot who he was, where he came from, and who his God is. He never forgot those things. So we can take note of that today in our lives. Now we have three parts today. We're going to look at verses 1 through 6, Joseph's success. And then we're going to look at Joseph's temptation, verses 7 through 12. And then our final part is Joseph's unfair treatment. And we're going to look at verses 19 through 23 in the chapter 39 of Genesis. So with that being said, once again, let's dive right into these scriptures and let's see where Holy Spirit leads us once again today. Verses 1 through 6, Joseph's success. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. That's an interesting verse there, that his master Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him and those things. We'll come back to that. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had, he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand. And he knew not aught he had save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So in verse number 1, we're introduced to this Egyptian here named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar's name is a derivative, if you will, or his name is referencing to the sun god Ra, R-A. So it is my impression and impression of many writers that this Egyptian leader here, Potiphar, was a pagan like anybody else, and he was named after the sun god Ra. And so we have an understanding here that he was an officer and a captain of the guard. So the officer and a captain, what this means is that he is a very high-ranking official. Many writers believe that he was in charge of the royal bodyguard or the royal army for the king, for the pharaoh. It's also believed that it's a possibility that he was in charge of the execution detail around these things. A very important individual here in Egypt, in the Egyptian culture, very high-ranking official, very large family, very rich, and so very well known in this area. Now, you look at this word officer here. One of the few of the writers wrote here, this word officer references is that he may well have been a eunuch, and in the Egyptian culture, that's some things that the kings often did is they would castrate the men that they was be up under their charge for a lot of different reasons. But it is believed that this word officer has the belief is, or is it means to castrate. So there's a good possibility he was a eunuch. Nonetheless, he was a very high-ranking official in the Egyptian culture and in Egypt here. And it says here in verse number 2, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, meaning Joseph was a prosperous man. What's this prosperous word mean? Well, prosperous is making progress as in succeeding. It's like everything he touched grew. Everything he touched multiplied. That's the idea we get here. It means he pushed forward. It means it is actually the opposite of failure. So everything that Joseph did turned out good. Is what we're talking about here. He was a prosperous man. And what it also means is that Joseph, and we see here, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And what it means also is that Joseph was profitable to his master, and his master witnessed this. That's interesting here in verse number 3 and 4, that this pagan officer, Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with him. How did he see that the Lord was with Joseph? And you have to look to Joseph's testimony. You have to take into account of how Joseph carried himself. You have to take into account of what Joseph represented, what he talked about perhaps. We know that servants didn't do much talking, but there's something about Joseph that his master saw that God was with him. And so this is interesting here. Joseph was a witnessing servant. Now, he may not have said very much, but the way he carried himself, like I said before, could have been a great witness to his master. So he was a witnessing servant to his pagan master. And on take it a step further, let's talk about his testimony. His testimony influenced him in such a way, his master. So his testimony was so influential to Potiphar that Potiphar just gave everything he had to Joseph. Here, you just take control of everything. I'm not going to worry about a thing because of you, Joseph, being here. And what a blessing that is. What a blessing it is. How trustworthy are you? What does your testimony say to people? Do people truly trust you in matters that really, things that really matter to them? We're talking about Potiphar's house. We're talking about everything they had to do with his house and fields. He gave it all. Joseph, take care of it. Take care of it. And so Joseph did. He trusts Joseph completely with all his items, with all of his stuff that he had. So what a blessing that is. God, you see God's hand in this all the way. Now in verses 5 through the first part of verse 6, Potiphar's house and field, both his house and field, was blessed. Why? It says for Joseph's sake. It was to a point that Potiphar was not concerned or knew what he had. The only thing he knew, according to number 6, the only thing that he knew was the bread which he did eat. So Potiphar, we got to realize, and I was thinking about this when I was going over this lesson. Potiphar was an officer and a captain. He had many, many responsibilities. He didn't want to have to worry about his family or his house being taken care of. And what a blessing it must have been for him to have someone like Joseph to fully trust to take care of his family matters and his house matters while he carried on the business of the government, if you will, of his job, of the officer and the captain. So the only thing that Potiphar was really knew about his family was when he sat down to eat supper. And he said there in verse 6, save the bread which he did eat. So that's the only thing that he was really knew. He didn't know of anything else. Joseph took care of everything. What a blessing that is to have someone you can fully trust and will fully take care of those things. Now, I said that in verses 5 through the first part of chapter 6. I want us to look at the last part of verse number 6. And Joseph, the writer here, he throws in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. Now, you look at these words, goodly and well-favored, they're not talking about the inner man. They're talking about the shape of this man. They're talking about the appearance of this man. So what are we saying? We are saying, and the Bible is saying, that Joseph was a handsome, strikingly handsome young man. And we know that he came into Potiphar's house when he was 17, possibly 18. We know he was sold into slavery when he was 17. Don't know how long it took him to get down there. We'll say 17 years old. So we know he's at least 17. And we're going to study about this in chapter 41. But he was there. It is believed because it is believed that he was in the Potiphar's house for 11 years, or at least up to 11 years, and he was in prison for at least 2 years. So we're looking at age 30 is when he became involved with the Pharaoh, and so some 13 years there. So he could have been anywhere from 17 up to 30 years of age, probably somewhere in the middle of that. It says he's goodly and well favored. He was a good-looking man and had a physique and all those things that went with it. The Lord had really blessed him in all things. And so this is what we're talking about in the last part of verse 6. We'll say, why would he throw that in there in the scripture? Well, what's going to happen in verses 7 through 12 can kind of give us an indication of why that was put in there, that he was goodly and well favored. So that can bring us to our second part, Joseph's temptation. And we get the idea sometime, and some writers get the idea sometime, that Joseph was a man of God, and it didn't really affect him what this pagan wife was doing to him. He was a man, just like you and I. You're listening tonight or today. Joseph was a man, and this woman was trying to seduce him and trying to get him to do something they did. So don't get the idea that Joseph, it was easy for him. And it could very well. Joseph made up his mind he was not going to do it, but he was still tempted to sleep with Potiphar's wife, and she was very convincing and adamant about this thing. So let's read verses 7 through 12. With this pagan woman here trying to get Joseph to sin with her. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. After these things, we're talking about the fact that now Joseph is over all things in Potiphar's house. And verse number 8 says, but he refused, being Joseph, he refused and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wanteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee. Because, why? Because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. He stayed away from her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, like he did every other day. And there was a problem. And there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he let this garment in her hand and fled and got him out. Now we look at these verses and we look at verse 7 and we see that I see the fact that Satan has taken notice of of Joseph and his faithfulness. This godly man here, this godly servant that is in this pagan house, in this pagan land, Satan has taken notice because he's been an influence, no doubt, to those around him. Satan takes notice now and attempts to bring this godly man down. I'm here to tell you right now, if you live for the Lord, Satan's going to try to bring you down. He's going to use every means he has. So Potiphar's wife, we have to understand, she's pagan anyway. She's lost. She's already given in to the temptation. She's already looked upon Joseph over and over again, and she likes what she sees, and she wants him. So she's already given into temptation. She's been tempted and already given into it. In her mind, she's already slept with him. Now Satan was going to use her to tempt Joseph. So we look at verses 8 through 12 and we see Joseph's responses to the temptation. And we have to get an understanding that Joseph was a young man. He did not have a wife. Far as we know, he had no relations at all. And so we have Potiphar's wife, and there's no doubt in my mind that Potiphar's wife was probably a beautiful woman there, probably very attractive. And I get an idea that she wanted to have Joseph because he was a good-looking man, and it could very well be that she ordinarily got what she wanted. Don't know that. That's just speculation. So she comes after Joseph. So this is the temptation of Joseph, and Joseph, we understand that Joseph was tempted to do these things, but he did not. Joseph's response to the temptation is, and according to verse 8, the first part, he immediately refuses. And this is what we need to do. Any temptation comes our way, immediately refuse it. If we delay turns into disaster. Delay is disaster when facing temptation. With temptation, with a known sin that we have, and we want to sit there and talk about it a little bit. No, flee from it, get away. He immediately refuses, according to the first part of verse 8. And then you look at the second part of verse 8 and the first part of verse 9. He recognized that sin always harms others. So we have to understand that. Say, well, this is only going to hurt me. I'll do what I want to do. No, that is never the case. Ever the case. Our sins affect everyone around us, and more importantly, it affects our testimony and it affects God. So we must have an understanding of that. He recognizes that sin always harms others, and according to verse 9, the second part of verse 9, he kept his eyes on sin's wickedness, not on its pleasure. Sin's pleasure is fleeting. He focused on the wickedness that this sin was, not the pleasure, the fleeting pleasure that was going to come from it. The last part of verse 9, he kept his thoughts on God, and he recognized that sin is primarily against who? It's primarily against God. And he recognized that, and he told her that. In verse number 10, he was faithful in saying no to constant temptation. You know, I get an idea that, I was teaching this lesson earlier today, I get an idea that when he walked into the house where he thought she might be, he was kind of like peeked around the corner. Is she around? Oh, thank you, Lord, she's not here. Let me go and do a deal. And I get the idea that he was avoiding her and trying to stay away from her because she was persistent day by day. But he consistently avoided her and consistently said no. And then finally, in verse number 12, verse 11 and 12, he fled temptation. He got out of there, left his coat there, and got out of there. Now we see in verses 13 through 18, not part of our focus, but we want to point out here, verses 13 through 18, that Potiphar's wife grabs his coat. We know that. And he fled and he left his coat there. So now he's gone. She's mad, but she has his coat. So she has some leverage there. And she gets this plan together. So after fleeing the temptation and leaving his garment in the hands of Potiphar's wife, what does she do? When Potiphar comes home, immediately she accuses Joseph of attempting to force himself on her. What she said was that he tried to force himself on, and then I screamed, I hollered out, and then he bolted out. I rejected him, and he bolted out. But he tried to lay with me. He actually, what she was basically saying was, he tried to rape me. But when I hollered out, he fled. And he left his coat. She didn't say anything about I grabbed his coat and kept his coat because I want to have some witness stuff. He said, and he was getting out of there so quickly that he left his coat. So let me ask you a question here. Who's Potiphar going to believe? The Hebrew servant or his wife? Well, he's going to believe his wife. Now we find that out in verses 19 through 23. Verses 19 through 23. And it came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, after this manner did the servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him, who? Joseph, and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph. You like that? I like that. And showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So in verse number 19, we see that Potiphar comes home. He is told the lie by his wife, and his anger explodes like a raging fire. He is very upset with Joseph, fully believes his wife. So what does he do? He throws Joseph into prison. And it says he's bound there in prison. Now this word bound, it can mean that he was put in chains. But what the writers here, what I believe here, this prison, because we know that he was free to roam around once the Lord took over and the keeper gave him things, he was not bound. This was more like a regular prison. He was bound by the bars. He was bound by the gates. He was bound by the locks. He was imprisoned, is what we're talking about here. So don't get the idea that Joseph here, and he could very well have been chained to the wall for some time, but don't get the idea that's where he stayed. This is not what we're talking about. This is an imprisonment, not necessarily in chains, but just locked up like he's in prison. Not a nice place. We say, he was in this nice prison because it was where the king's. No, this was still a dungeon. This was not a nice place. This was not a place where Joseph wanted to stay. We find that out. So once again, and find in verse number 21, once again, while everyone else left him, the Lord was with him. In verse number 21, I like this. But the Lord was with Joseph. And what did the Lord do? He showed Joseph mercy. This word mercy here in the Old Testament, it means goodness and kindness. And I'm here to tell you today that as a child of God, we must have an understanding. I want to encourage you, and I encourage myself to believe these things, that God's mercy is rich. There's plenty of it. And he gives it and pours it out to the child of God. It is his kindness. It is his goodness. Let me tell you something. As good as Joseph was, he deserved to die and burn in hell. But God's mercy, his kindness, and his goodness upon the child of God kept him safe. What a blessing it is for Joseph to be in this prison and to be taken care of by God. We as children of God, we are in this world and we're going through these terrible times, but we can look to Jesus and he can pour his mercy out on us. What a blessing that is. We see in verses 22 through 23 that just like Potiphar, Joseph's testimony influenced the keeper of the prison, and he assigned him to be the prison administrator, if you will. So what happened is that he went and he was overseer of Potiphar's house, responsible for everything in there, and then he gets thrown in prison, and guess what? He becomes the overseer, the administrator, if you will, of the prison. So now he has complete control of the prison. This is a prisoner that is over all the other prisoners and right up under the keeper of the guard, the keeper of the prison. So what a blessing that is. It's not part of our lesson focus, but we want to just look at chapter 40 just for a second. While Joseph is in prison, the chief butler and baker of Pharaoh is thrown into prison because Pharaoh was disgruntled with them for whatever reason, and they had a dream. Each one of them had a dream, and the butler had a dream and Joseph said, 3 days you're going to be restored to be the cupbearer back for Pharaoh. And then the baker was like, oh, well, great, I need you to interpret my dream. And so Joseph interprets his dream and says, well, in 3 days you're going to be hanged, your head's going to come off your head, and the birds are going to eat eat your head. So his wasn't quite it, and sure enough, 3 days later, the butler is restored and the baker is hanged because it's it's Pharaoh's birthday. But Joseph requests that the butler remember him, and we know if you read the story that the butler did not remember him. So Joseph is still stuck in prison at the end of chapter number 40. So what are we saying here today? We're saying that God often allows trials in the lives of his people. Even the children of God have trials and temptations in our life. Just have an understanding of that. These trials will come, but God will always prove faithful through him. Come to the end of this lesson, and I come with heavy hearts today. A dear friend of mine, Tim Holland, is not doing well, and I pray. I would pray that you would pray for him and his family. I was able to meet with him today, and praise be to God, he was saved some time back, and he couldn't wait to tell me and Connie and my wife that he was saved. Now, what a blessing it is. And Tim, if you are listening to this, man, I love you, brother. And like I said today, I'm gonna see you soon. And I'd like for you to remember my father in prayer. He is not doing well at all, and so we need your prayers, the Parrish family, and we would hope that you'd pray for my dad, George Parrish, and our family at this time. I love you, and I wish you the richest blessings on your day. Thank you.